Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Dr. Catherine Horton. With me is Kevin Annett. Before we start, I would like to make sure that you guys can hear me because we had quite a lot of sabotage of all types. So I'm just waiting in the background for the stream to start appearing on YouTube. Hang on my end, it's somehow not appearing. So let me just give me a moment. For the stream. Okay, sounds good. It sounds like you guys can hear me fine. Okay, so today is a very special episode because there's a breaking news, the announcement of the uncovery of mass graves of Indigenous women and children in British Columbia. And I would like to pass the microphone straight to Kevin Annett, who will update us today. Unfortunately, because of the sabotage of his camera, we can't show him, but he can share his screen and you can hear him. So he will be talking about the announcement. So welcome, Kevin, and let's get started because this is a bombshell.
Thanks, Catherine. I appreciate it. And you can see the screen here, I assume, the announcement. Today, this was a release that went out all over the world. And essentially what's happened is investigators on the west coast of Canada have discovered 3 separate mass graves of Aboriginal people. They've done some initial surveys and a lot of interviews of local people and have ascertained that these graves contain hundreds, if not the remains of possibly thousands of Native people over the years. Now, these graves are multi-layered. So, for example, at the lowest levels, you have people who died in the smallpox epidemics, the early 20th century. Then above that, you have children who were killed in the Indian residential schools. Most recently, women and others who were killed on what's called the Highway of Tears in northern British Columbia, where a lot of Native families have gone missing. So people can see from this report, which you can see online, murderbydecree.com, go to ITCCS updates, and you can see the entire release. But the investigators report that these are, as I mentioned, burials that are laid on top of each other. Local Native people have known about these sites, but they've been threatened and silenced by the RCMP and their own tribal council officials. These grave sites are on the coast and also in the interior of British Columbia. And residents claim that the ones responsible for the killings and burials were the RCMP themselves and what they call private hit squads. And one witness observed an RCMP tactical unit burying bodies as recently as late March of this year. So in response to that, at 10 o'clock this morning, a formal request was issued by the tribunal looking into these crimes. It's called the International Tribunal for the Disappeared of Canada. And they made a formal request in New York at the UN Security Council and to the UN peacekeepers, asking that forensic specialists and peacekeepers be immediately sent to BC, to British Columbia, to aid in the investigation and to also attend the War Crimes Tribunal that's convened there on September 16th. Now, Prime Minister Trudeau and 20 others have been summoned already, and we'll in a minute show you the indictment and the summons. And, this isn't a request we make lightly because, as we've talked about before, 7 of our Aboriginal members have been killed. Human Rights Watch out of New York has said openly that the RCMP are directly implicated in the murder and disappearances of Native women. And so it makes it all the more important to have that kind of international spotlight on what we're doing and protection. So we made that announcement today. We're going to be having another event in Ottawa on Parliament Hill, July 8th at 10 a.m. And at that time, we hope to have the peacekeepers and others present to begin to shine more of a spotlight on this whole ongoing crime.
This is just absolutely insane. The other thing is for those in Europe, the RCMP is the what does it stand for? The Royal Mounted
Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or they're called the Mounties sometimes. They're a national police force set up in the 19th century. Their stated purpose was to drive natives off the land to allow the railway to link up the country in the 1880s. And they've been, they're like a paramilitary force. They operate under their own jurisdiction, their own courts, and they've been at the forefront of the genocide You know, they were the ones who gathered up the native kids and brought them into these death camp residential schools. So they've been at the forefront of this whole genocide for sure.
And this is incredible. So basically what we're dealing with here, and this also explains why the police is not helping, is because the police was conducting the genocide in, you know, for basically the crown. Is that right?
That's right, very much. And if you can see these images here, the area in northern British Columbia, we've got a little map here, if you can see by the cursor. If you can see that all right?
Yeah.
This is called the Highway of Tears, Highway 16. Prince Rupert here is a super port. It's being built largely with Chinese investment. A lot of Chinese colonists are being brought in illegally and settled in this whole area. And also, this area from Dawson Creek down to Kitimat here on the coast is the largest liquid natural gas pipeline ever built in Canada. It's a $40 billion project. It involves, this is LNG, liquid natural gas. It involves major companies, including, you can see down here, Royal Dutch Shell, Mitsubishi, Petronas from Malaysia, PetroChina, which is the largest oil company in China, and Korean Gas. They're the ones who are doing this pipeline. Now, if you look at where the pipeline is running and then look back at that map, the pipeline runs like this. It runs right along the Highway of Tears, right where a lot of Native people have gone missing. So our theory, based on a lot of firsthand testimonies, is that Native families have been targeted, driven off the land, destroyed, because they've stood in the way of this LNG pipeline. And it's really that simple. Once again, it's big money driving genocide.
And then a Royal Dutch Shell would be owned by, as the name says, by the Royal Dutch family. Is that it?
And the Crown, the British royals themselves are very heavily invested in it. Royal Dutch Shell have been, if you've followed what went on in Nigeria in the 1980s and 90s, they led the genocide there, the Ogami people and others who, same story, they were Royal Dutch Shell were hiring private mercenaries to go in and drive blacks off their land to get the oil interests in Nigeria. Same thing going on now in northern British Columbia with Native people.
This is incredible, but it also sounds like because these genocides and crimes against humanity don't have a limitation period, that whatever you're building can be emulated for to get justice also for the Nigerians who lost their land. I mean, this is horrific. And I guess the entire idea would be to, and this probably ties in with what's happening today, because you said that the most recent burial that was witnessed was March 2019. If I had to guess, they are using the NSA database, the mass surveillance, to map out the families and their social ties and exterminate entire, bloodlines that have any sort of claim to the land.
That's right. There's our tribunal issued a report in September 2017 that it was called The Continuity of Genocidal Crime in Canada, and it showed that the very people who were destroying generations of children in these Indian residential schools and who were never tried for it, the same individuals are presently involved in the continued trafficking of children all through these Native villages. In a nutshell, the Native chiefs that are all government funded assist in terrorizing their own people off the land. They often do it by grabbing people's children to blackmail them to sign away their land rights. And these chiefs are often sitting on the boards of these very resource multinationals that are profiting from this. The Trudeau government is in bed in a big way with the Chinese cartel, PetroChina. Justin Trudeau, who made a big show over the last few weeks acknowledging genocide. Well, one of the reasons he had to do that song and dance in front of the TV cameras was his own personal complicity in these crimes that was brought out. He one of the first things he did when he was elected as Liberal Prime Minister was he removed all restrictions on Chinese investment in Canada. And he allowed, through something called the Foreign Investment Protection Act, or FIPA, he allowed the Chinese government to station security troops, including the Chinese army, on Canadian soil to protect their investments. So in northern British Columbia now, you see Chinese troops and security people operating openly. And just like the United States Marines used to do at dams and hydroelectric facilities in BC, because there's so much water, uranium, oil in that province. So it's the same old colonial game, but now it's operating across the Pacific.
Oh my goodness! So that sounds like a foreign invasion. So it sounds like that as a crown, what's it called? The crown estate. The British and the Dutch have sold the land rights, or part of the land rights, for exploitation to the Chinese. Actually, my thought on this is that the cartel is relocating to China. There are many indications for that, and there were people in the World Bank already saying it, that there's a big, reorientation towards the east. But what it means in real terms is that the Vatican crime cartel is shifting its weight from one leg to the other. So from its leg in Northern America and Europe, it's shifting it to Asia, and then using an Asian front to continue the very same asset stripping. And in a sense, what they're trying to do is blame the Chinese, even though I think, we can bet that those Chinese companies would again in turn be owned by the Vatican crime cartel, because it is the biggest, owner of global corporations anyway. So there's no way that they wouldn't own them.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you raised that, Catherine, because clearly the present so-called Pope, Francis, Jorge Bergoglio, one of the first things he did within the first few months of him being pretty much appointed as Pope was he opened up negotiations with China. And you found that a lot of Vatican money started going through Deutsche Bank in Germany into what's called the BRICS Alliance, the China, India, Russia kind of banking cartel network in Asia. So definitely the Vatican, as it's always done over the centuries, likes to play every side against itself. And they are definitely weighing, kind of pointing eastward. You could say that the two main factions in the Vatican now consist of the pro-China lobby around Bergoglio and the old guard European, North American, cardinals around Ratzinger. And so, that's part of the broader story here.
I'm intrigued that you mentioned Deutsche Bank, because one of the things I would like to show here, just as a footnote, is that there was a very, very important interview. Sorry, my end is being hacked here, so I am trying desperately to bring this up. But there is an interview by the former regulator, Professor William Black. And if I can, I would like to, while you bring that up, I'll just briefly share my screen. Because it's an important reference. You mentioned Deutsche Bank being involved in this. Now, Deutsche Bank has already been outed as a criminal enterprise, as yet another transnational criminal enterprise, right, like the Vatican itself, by the former regulator and academic Professor William Black. And here in this interview with USA Watchdog, he says Deutsche Bank crime weakens the global financial system. And there's many indications that Deutsche Bank is involved in such a staggering amount of criminality that even the shutting it down to send the financial markets in linear, because they're basically a big criminal hub, a big whale in the entire system. Now back to you, because that map is just, I think, the smoking gun, isn't it?
It is. Now I want to point out to folks. Here is Highway 16, if you can see my cursor.
Yeah.
The Highway of Tears, where so many people have gone missing over the last 30 years. It's in the hundreds, if not thousands. Whole families just vanishing. Now look at the liquid natural gas pipeline, which has been in the works for over 20 years. This is a huge consortium. None of these green boxes represent native bands that have signed agreements in the last few years. 10 years ago, only this one here had. Now there's 20 of them. What these agreements do, they make money for the chief and their families, but they sign away the lands and resources, because prior to these agreements, indigenous land was unalienable, right? It could not be alienated because it was traditional land. And what happened was all the hereditary elders who knew who owned the land were killed off. And the hidden story behind the missing women is that if you look at a lot of these first Aboriginal women who went missing, what was never mentioned in the media was, first of all, when their bodies were found, they were missing organs. All right. Secondly, and that was swabbed right out of the media and the police reports, but we have that from the families themselves who viewed the bodies. Secondly, these women tended to be descended from what are called the blue bloods, the matrilineal clans who were called clan mothers, who traditionally owned the land. They knew where the boundaries were. Now, if you want to get the land alienated and get the sellout chiefs to sign away the land, you got to get rid of them. So the disappearances of these Aboriginal women and their families was aimed to wipe out the traditionalists so that the land could be gotten that much easier and the chiefs could sign it away without any opposition. That, of course, was what the Trudeau Missing Women Inquiry was set up to hide and distract from. The real motive behind the wiping out of these Native women and their families. So all of a sudden, all these agreements are signed. What it does is it reduces Indigenous title. It makes every tribe a corporation, what's called a First Nation. You might see that term a lot in the press, First Nations. First Nation is a corporate designation. The Indigenous nation has become a corporation under Canadian law, like a city council. They can then alienate and sell off their land. And that's why there's so many of these agreements. The chiefs get paid off. People are thrown out, wiped out. A lot of the homeless natives I work with in Vancouver, they're all refugees from their own land, being forced out at gunpoint by their own chiefs, who often sit on the board of directors of these companies. So this is a connection between the native elites, the churches, the government, the traditional actors of genocide working with these big corporations.
This is just so sickening. I have to say, this is sickening. I mean, first of all, it shows you a lot of things. I mean, the other thing that is not really talked about is that when you have these women, there's always a network of women behind it, and women's approach to solving problems is very different from men's. So while men like to gang up, women tend to very often be lone fighters or can act as lone fighters, continuing the cause in the face of severe adversity, but they also talk to everybody. So the news spreads much quicker, right? And I think if they want to exterminate the people, they always attack the women first, right? So if you want to also wipe the memory, I mean, it's women who remember all the birthdays and remember all this stuff, and that's what they would go for. But the other question I have is, when you mentioned removal of organs, I mean, first of all, organ trafficking can be used, can of course make extra profit, but it also can be used as a cover-up so that people would go for suspecting organ trafficking, looking for the perpetrators in the medical field maybe, whereas the perpetrators here have to do the natural glass. The other question I would have is, in those cases where organs were removed, was the heart removed as well? Because another thing is, when you set up these big corporations and these big corporation-y projects, and you get new people to sit on boards, the way the cartel works is that they all have to take part in ritual sacrifice of humans, as in murder. And what would very often happen is that the heart would be cut out. So if there are organs missing, was the heart also missing?
Right.
That's what I would wonder.
Well, a lot of those details, it's been put together in the deposition of the citizen prosecutor, who's going to be presenting a lot of this starting September 16th in Vancouver. There's a war crimes trial there that's opened up. 21 people have been summoned and indicted, and I'll show you that in a minute. But here's the thing. I believe with you that there's definite cult ritual killings going on. But there's another aspect of that, is that by emphasizing that, in a way it's a distraction, because these are not simply ritual killings. This is mass genocide to drive people off the land. Yeah. And in a way, if you want to distract from who's really doing it, you could say, oh, look, it's just somebody who wants their organs. It has nothing to do with the pipeline or whatever. So it can be used as a distraction at the same time. So we're kind of wary about giving one cause to all of this. I mean, it's an interlocking kind of crime cartel going on here. And yes, organ trafficking goes on for sure. We know that some of the Chinese generals doing that in China are investors in the same liquid natural gas company. So I'm sure there is, correlation there. But we have to also look at the big money. It's like anything, follow the money. You'll see who's really pulling the strings, right?
The other thing that you can follow in addition to the money is also the NSA will have all the communications. So all the social connections of these people would be mapped. all of them. And the cartel, which is, you know, also using the NSA, would just do it routinely. And every single one of these people is under surveillance by the very cartel as well. So there's not just financial trails, there's also telecommunication trails that can be used. I mean, in principle, you can map every single one of these. And the other thing is that there has to be a chain of command connecting it to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police.
Yes. Well, you know, I've worked for almost 30 years. I've worked in urban areas in Canada, especially Vancouver. And over the years, you see this image I'm showing here. These are some of the early women who went missing. I could point out a number of these women, like here, I think her. They were all working on the streets of Vancouver. I knew them. I was a street minister, and I knew these women. And the disappearances started well before they were ever reported. And it was common knowledge it was the Mounties and the Vancouver police doing it. As a matter of fact, for 9 years, I had a show, Vancouver Co-op Radio, and it was called Hidden from History. It's how a lot of these stories first got surfaced. And I was fired, thrown out of the studio, barred from the premises, right after I aired a program where 2 eyewitnesses said they saw 2 senior Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers taking women out to what was called Piggy's Palace. It was where a serial killer called Willie Pickton was torturing women, filming them for snuff films, and then disposing of the bodies. In fact, it wasn't him. It was a whole network of senior politicians, former prime minister, Mountie officers, you know, who were involved in this killing network. And I aired that, and bang, I was out quicker than you could spit. So, you know, the evidence is all over. It's not a matter of lack of evidence. It's a question of then what do you do about it? How are you going to indict the powers that are still in power, right?
So in this list of people indicted, do you have all these individuals who have been, you know, flagged by eyewitnesses as having been involved in these murders?
Yes, I'm trying to find that for you. I'm just jumping around here. Oh, here, this is important. Can you see this image here?
Yes.
This is the Vancouver Club in downtown Vancouver. It's the elite, you know, members only club. It's got the top financial, all the judges, Supreme Court judges, politicians, prime ministers, they're all members of this members only club. We've had, since 1998, when we did our first tribunal in Vancouver, we had eyewitnesses who saw children being taken in to the rear of this club and never seen again. These were often children from the local Squamish Indian reservation, and they were taken in there. There was once children who appeared at 3 a.m. at the back of the club, and a reporter tried interviewing them because he was staking the place out. He was hit from behind, his tape recorder stolen. I mean, these kinds of incidents happen routinely here. When we first exposed the Vancouver Club, a year later, from our sources, the abductions and the killings moved to private yachts off the coast of Vancouver, forming a thing called the 12 Mile Club, referring to the 12-mile territorial limit around Canada. Outside that limit, they would take the children and dispose of them in the ocean. So they're tied in very much with this thing as well. And, you know, so it's part of the whole illness.
This is absolutely incredible, because what you are saying is that all the Supreme Court judges were in a club that ritualistically murdered children. Now, I'm not surprised at all, because the way the cartel works is at the very, very top, they are all in it together and have been for centuries. So, you know, at some point, at these very old institutions, very high institutions, you just get a layer of psychopaths, and they need to generate these control files, and they have to be, during the process of making a control file, they also have to kind of, it's a dominance display of how sadistic they can be, to just show the other psychopaths that they're equally sick in the head. But what that means is that all the Supreme Court judges in Canada were part of this ring. Would you say that they were all involved and that they all would have taken part, or is it just some and the rest were used as a cover?
Well, it's like with the churches or the police, they all know about it. And even if they aren't directly involved, they cover for each other. Now, under the law, whether you're hiding the murder weapon or you're pulling the trigger, it's the same offense under the law. It's aiding and abetting crime. And so, yes, they are, as a whole institution, liable. Just like somebody who donates money to the Catholic Church on Sunday morning, you're aiding and abetting a transnational criminal organization, and you're subject to arrest in a just world if you do that. But let me show you. Can you see the public summons here on the screen?
Yes, I can.
This was issued on right a few days after Prime Minister Trudeau made his comment acknowledging genocide. Now, under the UN Convention on Genocide, once it is acknowledged and proven, the member states that are signatories to the UN Convention on Genocide are obligated, and here's the word, prosecute and punish. They must prosecute and punish genocide. So we acted on that that convention, and this summons was issued under the Law of Nations to these individuals to appear before a tribunal on September 16th to answer questions about their complicity and knowledge of these crimes. Here's the Governor General, the Queen's representative, Julie Payette. She's the actual head of state in Canada. She can dismiss the government tomorrow. It's this colonial system. Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister. Luigi Bonazzo, Vatican Papal Nuncio. He's the top Vatican official in Canada. Liu She, he's the ambassador to the People's Republic of China. Interestingly, the day after he got this, he was recalled to China. Literally. Actually, it was 2 days. Within 48 hours on June 9th, he was recalled to China after getting served this. These two officials of PetroChina, Richard Fadden, former director of the CSIS, Canadian Security Intelligence Service, they're like the CIA in Canada. Richard Fadden said over 10 years ago that the Chinese government was infiltrating the British Columbia government and subverting its operations to benefit China. He said that. Then he was forced to resign, but he's being summoned as a witness. All of these other people, RCMP officials, cardinals of the Catholic Church, this Michael Miller in Vancouver, he's a direct participant in the Ninth Circle and the 12 Mile Club. Fred Hiltz, again, same story. Bob Bennett. These individuals in the United Church, all directly involved in the West Coast 12 Mile Club child trafficking network. Now, these people are summoned to appear Monday, September 16th in Vancouver. And if they don't appear, they can be, writs can be issued for their arrest, and the judgment may go against them, at which point a common law court can be convened, and they can be tried as war criminals. Here's the actual indictment. And the first count in the indictment says the government, Privy Council Office, Crown of England, the Vatican, these churches are all involved in a deliberate, ongoing criminal conspiracy. And you see the chart, what they're doing here. Committing a war of extermination, trafficking, harming, torturing children, occupying and exploiting the lands and resources of Native people, financially defrauding the people of Canada by falsely posing as churches to avoid tax-exempt status, to avoid taxation, rather, and then concealing all these crimes, obstructing justice. Now, in a nutshell, what this indictment says is if you continue to do these crimes, under international law, you've lost your authority to govern, to levy taxes. Canadians are then obligated to not vote. There's a federal election on October 21st in Canada. Not to vote, because that's to aid and abet representatives of the Queen, members of Parliament. Not to pay taxes, and to actively prosecute and stop these crimes in your own country. So this is very serious. I mean, this is, international law being applied by the citizens themselves. And as we found in our first court cases that forced Ratzinger to resign, it has great weight, not just morally, but other courts can then issue arrest warrants. So these people are very concerned about what's going on. We already know that. And it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next 3 months.
Well, can you go back to the list of indictments? I mean, first of all, that's quite a, quite a list. I've just got a couple of stupid questions. If you go back to the list of names at the very, very top.
Oh, and the summons. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. The summons. Sorry, that's what I meant. That's what I meant. The summons. Now here in this list, this is a very stupid question, but I noticed that all the names are in all caps. Do you mean the natural person, or do you mean these fancy trusts that were set up in our name here? Good
question. It's deliberately put in the capital letters because as fiduciary officers, that is their identity. So if we just said the natural person, Julie Payette, she said, well, the natural person isn't the governor general, so I can ignore this. So we are summoning the corporation called Julie Payette. And because of the way they operate, their natural person is part and parcel of that corporate person. So you see, if we didn't talk about the corporate identity, they could evade it, right? But they can't evade, that's their official title, right? So they can't evade it on that basis.
I guess what I don't understand is that there's something that the UK judges were very, very careful, and they banged on about it. And at the time I was very naive and innocent, and I didn't know what it meant. But they said about not being able to pierce the corporate veil. Now, what it was set up to mean was that when you own a company and you have a limited liability company, then if your company tanks, your private assets can't be, used. So this is what's meant by not piercing the corporate veil. But knowing how the Illuminati and their doublespeak works, I'm wondering if that can also be extended to mean that only the corporate identity of, for example, Julie Payette would be then in for it, but not the natural person. Can you indict both the natural person plus?
Under their system, it's assumed that both are one and the same. And if you just indicted the natural person, they, as that official, could then ignore you. Realistically, we are indicting institutions. We're not going after individuals. That's the other important legal point here. This is not like in a typical kind of commercial court where you are seeking restitution, from some tort offense. You want compensation from this person because of an offense. No, we are saying the problem isn't individuals, it's the system as a whole. And as the CEOs of the system, they are corporately and individually liable. Now, in the this is just the first summons. In the subsequent court documents, it will be very clear that not only the institutional, that corporate identity, but the flesh and blood person, Julie Payette in lowercase, is also going to be named. So in the court proceedings, both are going to be named, but this was necessary in terms of casting the net around their institutional identity, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I think this is a very important point to make because so much depends on it in their system. But I guess what you're also doing is you are using a common law tribunal, and I guess there you are at some point talking about the actual flesh and blood people who have been doing this.
That's right, because it's a given maxim of common law. No one is above the law. It doesn't matter what your title is. Once you pierce that corporate shell you're talking about, that man, Michael Miller, is responsible for all of his actions and regardless of his corporate identification. He can and should be tried, just like Elizabeth Windsor was, or Joseph Ratzinger, or whoever.
Yeah. Now, the other question I have is for the type of charges you have, what is the penalties you're going for? What's the maximum penalty?
Oh, well, under international law, traditionally crimes against humanity carry a life sentence, and or multiple life sentences. In some countries, it's a death sentence. And don't forget, we're operating within Canada, but it's under common law, which is universal jurisdiction. So in a common law trial, the jury has complete leeway to decide what the sentence is to be. And it's really up to the jury, who's kind of the engine in a common law court system, not the judge. The verdict and the sentence are established by the jury.
So does it mean that in Canada these people could be could receive a death penalty? Yep.
Regardless of the statute law, because don't forget the abolition of the death penalty in Canada in the 1970s, that was simply a statute. Yeah. And the statute doesn't govern international or common law.
Yeah.
And, it requires consent. So if people don't consent to it, it doesn't have authority over them.
The other question is about compensation. Under the common law, what type of compensation can people get? I mean, are we talking monetary compensation? How much? And can, for example, children of murdered parents also get compensation?
Well, the language isn't compensatory because, again, that's tort language. That's a civil offense at court, like when you break somebody's window, you're compensated. We're talking under criminal law, it's reparations.
Mhm.
And that's a different concept. It means that, for example, the Catholic Church, as it stands now, has lost its right to collect income. Its property and assets are null and void and can be seized and should be seized by people as reparations for centuries of crime.
Yeah.
So we're talking the seizure of church buildings and church assets. We're talking about seizing the assets and property of any corporation, government, or church involved in this stuff. So it goes beyond individual compensatory. It's moral and material reparations for centuries of crime.
Yeah. And because one of the things I'm wondering is when you get these, if you get these people sentenced or whatever it's called, you've got a judgment against them. What is the conduit for getting reparations or any type of compensation to the victims?
Well, take for example the target of this genocide, Indigenous people. And any non-Indigenous person in Canada who's paying taxes, those taxes now lawfully should be nullified. If you took all of the wealth produced every year in Canada and divided it equally among all 33 million Canadians, every Canadian would have an income of over $248,000 if it was distributed equally. It shows you the enormous wealth in Canada and how it's largely being siphoned right out of the country. So that wealth needs to be seized, kept, and distributed in ways that are going to help people. So returning land to Native people, and not through the existing Native bodies, which are all colonial bodies run in the interests of government chiefs. We're talking about the people themselves. That's why we say, the long-term solution to this, when in the movement in Canada to establish a republic, you stand outside Crown jurisdiction altogether. You say, we're keeping our taxes in our communities. We're establishing a new jurisdiction. And in fact, one of the jurisdictions that this tribunal is going to be operating under in Vancouver in September is under the Republic of Canada, which established a lawful jurisdiction under common law in January 2015. So people can stand under the umbrella of that republic and say, and we've done this successfully. When police show up, we say, you have no authority over us, right?
Wow. That is absolutely staggering. Can people find out somewhere more about the establishment of this republic? Because I think many people around the world would want to emulate that.
Yes, there's, as a matter of fact, prior to September, there's a new website going up. The republic was operating very much off the radar for the last 3 or 4 years because of the level of attack they were getting. They're like working underground in many ways, setting up these grassroots networks. But they're going to surface. There'll be a website up by September, just prior to this, announcing the jurisdictional protection of the republic over this tribunal. And for now, there's books that have been produced on this. People can write to Republic of Canada, Kanata, Republic of Canada @gmail.com. And there's documents that have been posted about that we can send out to them.
This is fascinating. So I guess the idea would be to cycle the country back, or for the first time actually, into a republic gradually. And would that happen region by region, or is the republics, the boundaries covering the entire current, boundaries of Canada?
Yeah, definitely within what's called the Dominion of Canada, the land, seas, resources of the whole area. And don't forget, even under British Crown law, Crown authority was lawfully abolished by Parliament in 1649. It was then unlawfully restored by military coup 11 years later in 1660 by so-called Charles II, who did not have the authority of anyone to reestablish monarchy in England. So under British law, since 1660, the monarchy has been operating on a de facto but not a de jure basis, because monarchy was abolished by the Republic in 1649. And that's really the basis of what the Republic of Canada is doing. We're saying, the Commons, which is the people gathered in Parliament under their own authority, has all authority. Monarchy doesn't. And just because it's ruling on the basis of a coup in 1660 doesn't give it lawful authority or legitimacy. So we're kind of reviving that memory among people all through the British Commonwealth to say, whether you're in Australia or England or Canada, the Crown of England has no lawful authority, especially now since it's engaged in war crime. You know.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
This is I mean, this is really important. I guess what people have to understand, what we started with were the mass graves, but the only reason the mass graves are there is because it's a crown estate, and people are being murdered by these these shady groups and these secret societies that have ties all the way to the Supreme Court. You mentioned the 12 Mile Club. And they are murderous psychopaths. They are a global collective of murderous psychopaths dividing up the land and the spoils from the land among each other. And I think when you establish a republic, that's the first step. I guess you would also have to establish things like courts again from scratch, and then eventually you would have to establish your sheriffs again from scratch to have a local police force.
Well,
right?
one of the things that we can send out to people interested in this as a model for what you can do in your own countries is when you write to republicofcanada@gmail.com, one of the things that will be sent out to you is draft of constitution, because all authority in a republic is constitutionally based. Yeah. And what that means is people themselves have a role in writing that constitution at a local level. What do we do? We've done this in America and Canada. And in Ireland, we convene what are called local common law assemblies, and 12 or more men and women can establish their own authority as a legislative body, draft laws, enforce their own laws, elect their common law sheriffs, their common law courts, local militia to defend their courts and their communities. In other words, taking back power the way it happened, in any revolution. So from the grassroots. So that's it's really reinventing nations from the grassroots, and that way people can control the process. It's not, like in England, there was an attempt to set up. There's a movement there to establish they call it a republic, but all they're talking about doing is saying, well, we take out the queen and we put in a president, then we've got a republic. No, we're not talking about shifting the figureheads. We're talking about a fundamentally different way of operating society, where it's self-governing. People are self-governing in their own communities.
How do you get, because you mentioned several big corporations involved there, so PetroChina and so on, and you also mentioned that their entire, it sounds like Chinese mercenary troops on the ground. Now, what is the mechanism to get those people back out again? Because they sound like a hostile foreign power on your land.
Yep.
Well, is there a way to file, for example, commercial liens on these people within the current commercial law?
Not within Canada, not within Crown courts, because as we've tried numerous times with the residential school genocide, we tried filing charges in Canadian courts against the churches and the Crown. And on 3 occasions, provincial Supreme Courts ruled that one cannot charge the Crown or its agencies, chartered agencies like these churches, with genocide. It's ultra vires. It's beyond their jurisdictional competence, is the way they put it. So yeah, they're not going to. The Crown cannot be, and the Queen, for example, cannot be tried under their own laws, but they can be tried under international law and the law of nations, and that's exactly what we're doing. Right. So that's what the word sovereign means. It means you can't be tried under the law of the land, but the law of the land, the way it's set up now, is designed to protect these elites, not ensuring the rights of the people.
Absolutely. Yeah, I guess what they have set up is a global slave colony, because they played the same sort of game all across the Commonwealth, which already covers a large part of the earth. Then they played the same game in the US, which is a hidden crown colony, and for example, Germany is a hidden crown colony as well. And then of course in places like Nigeria, as you mentioned. So
yes,
this is fascinating. Now, returning to the actual mass graves, and are the excavations currently running? And if so, what's the time schedule? And how many mass graves did you find?
Well, we had already done a survey across Canada of 28 mass graves just connected to the residential schools, and 7 of those were in British Columbia. Now, of the 7 residential school graves, we know that 2 of them correlate with graves of these women. So it was a common practice to use existing graves because they're already protected. Often they're on military land or area that can be monitored in case people start digging around. And so there's definitely a connection. But part of the press release that we showed you earlier is demanding that UN peacekeepers show up and forensic specialists who can go in there, do the digs, get the hard forensic evidence, determining cause of death, who's responsible, do a crime scene investigation, in other words. But of course, it's all uphill because you'll be battling the very police agencies in Canada that did the crime, like the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So that's why international attention is needed. We encourage people. This tribunal on September 16th is going to be open to the public. It'll be in a very public place in Vancouver, inviting everyone to observe this and for eyewitnesses to come forward, tell their story, the whole thing. So it'll be very much a public forum.
The other question I have is, because knowing how these criminals operate, once you have flagged the mass grave sites, are they under any sort of surveillance from your side that you make sure that evidence isn't removed and the bones and the remains aren't removed by the criminals?
That's exactly what the teams connected to the court have already, or to the tribunal, have already started to do. They're monitoring these sites. They're working with local Native people who know the area the best. They've got these natives keeping an eye on things. The problem is when it's anywhere near a reserve, these are reservations in Canada are under a separate law. It's called the Indian Act, which is against, it's an illegal law under international law. You're not allowed to have race-based legislation, but they do in Canada. And under the Indian Act, the chiefs they're oligarchies, these reservations. They can do whatever they want to people on their own reservation. So it's very dangerous for natives to operate off the reserve, because of the way the chiefs themselves are part of these crimes. And so it's, again, an uphill battle, but the only weapon we've always had is popular awareness and participation. That's our strength. And also, these criminal bodies, they know they're guilty, so they're very easy to provoke. And we found that over the years that it's very easy to provoke these people to expose themselves. So you just have to be audacious enough. During the tribunal and before that, we're going to be having public actions, church occupations, the usual gamut of things that we do to bring public attention to these crimes.
The other thing is, are you going to publish the grave sites where they are? Are they still being kept kind of, secret or at this moment?
Do you mean
yeah, are you going to publish the precise locations of these places?
The three that were referred to in the press release cannot be announced before the tribunal because they're part of in the docket. There's going to be all of the evidence, so we can't release that evidence prematurely. It would compromise the evidence. It would compromise the people there and witnesses who are going to come forward and corroborate things like seeing the Mounties burying people at night, that kind of thing. That aspect, but there will be, related evidence. For example, the 28 mass grave sites near residential schools. We even have film of Mounties destroying residential school graves after they were identified by local natives. So, I mean, their guilt is written all over them, and they know it very much, right?
That's just incredible. And this is really, I think this is an extremely heavy topic, because you also mentioned that these mass graves are mostly of women and children. Is that right?
Very much. You see, like you mentioned, for genocide to work, it's aimed at the mother-child bond, because that's the future of any society. And the women very much, especially in indigenous nations in North America, very matrilineal based. And so the women traditionally would have the ancestral knowledge. These clan mothers, they would appoint the chiefs. Like, the word chief is a European invention. There aren't really chiefs in indigenous culture. That was created by the colonial governments. They say, okay, the men are all now the boss. That's not the way it worked. For example, among the Mohawk Confederacy in the East, war chiefs would be appointed by the clan mothers, because they would know grandmothers know children. They know the kids in the community. They know who's responsible, who isn't, who can be trusted. they would appoint war chiefs, but then the war chief would have no authority over her, and they would just be the leader in time of war, and then after they would stand down. But the authority was the clan mothers, and that's why they were so heavily targeted for destruction. When the Catholic missionaries were first come in, the first thing they'd do is they would bring in converted Catholic chiefs, kill off all of the traditional women and men who were the local leaders, and put these chiefs in the longhouse as the bona fide chiefs now. And their descendants still run the tribal councils on a lot of these reservations in Canada. So that's the system still at work.
That's incredible. Yes, and I guess those new chiefs will become the handlers of the entire community then.
That's right. And if you go against it, you're taking your life in your hands very much.
Yeah. Oh gosh. So the next, the big dates to watch now. You mentioned September the 16th. That's going to be the big court case. And
well, before that, there's at the bottom here, you'll notice Monday, July 8th at 10 a.m. The Canadian Network is going to be holding a gathering press conference right on Parliament Hill in Ottawa. Mm-hmm. And members of Parliament, Senate, the media, they've all been invited. And these members of Parliament and senators are all servants of a criminally convicted foreign power. They take an oath of allegiance to the Queen Elizabeth and her descendants, not to the people of Canada. So they're really agents of a foreign power. And there have been stand-down orders issued against any servant of the Crown in Canada. That's the police, the RCMP, the judges, civil servants, politicians. And if they don't stand down, they're given a chance to do the right thing. But if they don't, they're going to be considered criminal actors in this. So it's very interesting. This is happening right as an election is brewing in Canada, because just as these politicians are campaigning, they're going to be hit with this. At election rallies, they're going to be saying, it's time to step back. Voting in Canada is not only wasted, but it's an act of treason because you're handing your authority over to a foreign power.
Absolutely. The other question is, here I also see mentioned the UN peacekeepers to be present. Now, one question I have, and that's because I'm at the mercy of the UN genocide plans and the agenda, Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030. Now, how did you in the past get any help from the UN or these UN peacekeepers?
Not as a group. It's like when you're dealing with in the native world, you don't see organizations coming forward, but you have individuals inside and outside the system who are helpful. Mm-hmm. Mostly people in the system provide good information. For example, we tipped off Interpol about 10 years ago now about the child trafficking coming in through Portugal. And then there's a direct pipeline from the Madeira Islands and Portugal right through Holland and the Netherlands. And we notified them of that, and they eventually arrested about 1,000 people. They actually found over 30 children in cages just outside Brussels, based on the information we provided them. So the honest people in the system do act on what we give them, and they in turn give us information. The peacekeepers themselves, it's completely political. It's run in a very political way, of course. And they'll nevertheless be under pressure to do something. And that's without the illusion that they're going to actually respond, we still put the pressure on them and say, fine, if you're not going to do it, we're going to have our own Commonwealth peace officers that'll do it. And we already found on the streets of Vancouver, when the police showed up, we issued them stand-down orders. And they always backed off because they knew that they would be caught in the crossfire of having protected a criminal body like the Vatican. So it's psychological warfare. It's like anything,
Absolutely. No, I'm very pleased about that. And also, as you were talking, it just occurred to me that I should also notify Interpol about all the crimes being committed with directed energy weapons, because I've sure as hell can tell you that neither the national police in the UK or in Germany is doing anything about it. They are just as complicit as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police was, partaking in a current active live genocide.
Yes.
This is very, very encouraging. And the other thing that I find very encouraging is that you now have this large network and people are working together to bring this about at last. I think what we have to do as onlookers, if you like, is support you any way we can, and also learn from you and emulate it as quickly as possible. Because, you know, while this is raging, these are the people who already have been murdered. And at the same time, you also have things like the 5G rollout, which is an integrated directed energy weapon system that will be used specifically for things like that. So then you don't even have to send people to murder somebody. The 5G weapon system can take out people individually, so pulse them, you know, and you can just feed the NSA database right in, find out who is an inconvenient person and have them killed off, and the only thing you will know is that these people get cancer and die
Right.
very quickly. So that's, yeah.
Well, it's making those links. We talked about this before, Catherine, like at the tribunal, I encourage you and others to send important evidence concerning the directed energy weaponry, because don't forget, the first techniques were tried out on Native children in Canada in these Indian hospitals in the 50s and 60s, and children all over in these hospitals. So we're putting together the history of this is an important way to fight it today, to knowing where it came from.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So how can the viewers help you, Kevin?
Well, they can sign up, join up. There are going to be support actions happening at the time of the tribunal in other countries. We want people to picket Canadian consulates, help occupy Catholic churches, Church of England, the United Church. There's a whole network forming. You can write to the main tribunal office, itccsoffice@gmail.com. Write to me, thecommonland@gmail.com. Murderbydecree.com under ITCCS updates is the way to keep weekly updates, following the updates there. Also, our radio show every Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern, bbsradio.com/Here We Stand. And I wanted to show you this final picture. It's kind of amusing, if you can see it. Here I am with a bunch of Mohawk people. We're on Parliament Hill. This is the Canadian Parliament. And I was just saying here in the megaphone, I was renouncing my Canadian citizenship. I was standing under the authority of the Republic, which is an ally with the Mohawk Nation, who are self-governing. And here's a Royal Canadian Mounted Police guy just standing there. And I said to him, I turned to him and I said, I'm committing treason. I call for the arrest of Elizabeth Windsor as a head of state of Canada, and come and arrest me. And this guy kind of looked away and looked embarrassed and didn't do anything, right? And to me, it's a symbol of when you take on the system, it's a facade. And the people in it know they're guilty, they know they're criminal actors, but if you put it in their face, they back down. And this is what we have to do now. We have to move from word to action. We know what the problem is. We've had ad infinitum investigations. We don't need more. We need action now to stop these crimes and retake our own countries back from these criminals.
Absolutely. I completely support that. It is first and foremost a confidence game. And,
yes.
If you don't fall for the trick and you have more confidence than they try to push on you, then you win. Absolutely.
I want to show you this one too. This was during one of our occupations at the Catholic Church in Vancouver. This was a Native woman who stood up and challenged the Archbishop for what he was saying. He was telling lies from the pulpit about, there were no children killed in residential schools. So this Native woman stood up and challenged him. She was immediately grabbed by this Vancouver policeman and dragged out of the pew of the church during the service, right in the middle of the church service. Look at the look on his face compared to the look on her. She's confident and brassy, and he's doing his dirty job, right? Yeah. And that, to me, is another sign of the moral high ground we have on all of this, right?
Exactly. And the other thing that I find freaky is that now you have police officers and security personnel inside churches.
Yes, they were standing at the door because we had done an occupation the week before, so they were quite paranoid about us. And so, I mean, you have a lot of fun in these things, and that's important, to realize the numbers are on our side. It's like the Percy Shelley poem, "Rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few." I love that.
It's so true. It is very, very true. The other thing that also comes out of this is that after the September trial, it might turn out that the entirety of PetroChina, what was it called? Was PetroChina that's operating in Canada?
Yes.
is partaking in crimes against humanity, would it mean that also their property could be, could be seized?
Absolutely.
I think,
You know,
that's something that the CEOs will find highly interesting, is to, that all their investment is not so protected after all if they engage in crimes against humanity.
That's right. And that's the important point, that they're all liable for these crimes, whether here in the Vancouver Club, the liquid natural gas consortiums. It's all up to now we the people whether we're going to allow this to carry on. So
yeah. The other thing, a very, very big question that just occurred to me, I meant to ask it earlier, which is about the indictment of the Canadian, the head of the Canadian Secret Intelligence Service. I guess this is domestic intelligence that he was the chief of.
Canadian Security Intelligence Service. No, domestic intelligence is traditionally the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. CSIS acts like the CIA. They look at foreign influences in the country.
He's basically the Five Eyes member. He's the Canadian MI6, so to speak. I understand the Canadian CIA. The question is, in this trade, the human trafficking that you tracked, wouldn't the Foreign Intelligence Service be the people who organize it and the guardians of that trade?
Well, that's a very good point, and that's why it was astounding that he made that comment. He was forced into early retirement after that. And, like somebody on a pension, I guess they're trying to control him that way. And we'll see if he responds to the summons. But that's really important. He could be a key witness in this whole thing.
Well, but I guess what I'm getting is that he's one of the key perpetrators on the whole thing, because he would be working with other, foreign intelligence chiefs in organizing the international human trafficking and ensuring that the delivery of goods, as in the children, arrive.
Right.
Because
very likely.
It is. I mean, it's not just likely; it is physically impossible to conduct any such trade without the intelligence service knowing about it.
Oh, agreed. Yeah, yeah, and that's. I think I'd be surprised if she showed up. But the interesting thing I've found over the years is that there's a lot of divisions within the. The elites always have to portray themselves as unified, homogeneous, all powerful, but they're not. And their differences can be exploited. So we look for those differences, right?
Absolutely. Well, I hope you get this bastard. And if you don't get him, you get him on the rebound, for the direct energy weapon attacks and so on.
I hear you. Yeah.
Entire list, we're not short of crimes to get these people for. So Kevin, what is your final message to the audience?
Just, I hope everyone uses this tribunal in September as a time to rally and conduct your own actions wherever you are along the same lines. Write to me, thecommonland@gmail.com, because most of the work I do is traveling around helping people in organized common law workshops and training programs. Training now is key because we're equipping people to take action for themselves now. We're not looking to anybody else to do it for us. So I would say realize that it all begins with you, who's ever listening to this, and work out from there. So we have that power within each of us.
Thank you, Kevin. This is exactly right. So I encourage my viewers to take action, be there, get in touch with Kevin, educate yourself, and most importantly, use your networks. They are the most powerful thing to spread this message and to really, smear this information around cyberspace so that it reaches every last person, so that they know what is happening, and be very aware that this is not just something that has happened in the past out there, somewhere very far in the far corner of Canada. This is something that happened all around the world, and even in our local communities, we were just not aware. So this genocide program has been truly global, and all the many victims that you can see, and all the people fighting, well, they are fighting really for you, and they're fighting for a model that you can adopt everywhere around the world. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope to hear more good news from Kevin soon. Thank you very much, Kevin, for having given us your time.
Thanks, Catherine.